Okay, so what we'll be doing basically is taking the Torah portion, again, matching it with its twin in Exodus, that actually gives us a little more information about marriage so that we can decode this honeymoon year or the happy year, whatever we want to call it, that's commanded in the Torah portion. And I think it's interesting that this does not occur in most marriages. In fact, if we numbered the marriages where the young men were getting ready to go off to war and got married right quick, it would probably far surpass the young men who stayed at home for a year and made their wives happy before they went and fulfilled military obligations. So again, we see where the ethics of the Torah clashes with the ethics of the world. And again, it demands that as Israelites, we trust him to fight our battles, which is part of the reason I wanted to read that section out of the Maccabees last week, so that you could see Judah Maccabee applying this principle of this very Torah portion, applying that principle and saying, basically, if you're faint-hearted, then you need to go back home because you're already planning to fail. And as we can see from this Torah portion, if you don't give your wife her happy year in that first year, then you might be doing it unwittingly, but you're also making plans for your marriage to fail. Ultimately, it may not mean that you're headed for divorce, but you're making plans for your marriage to not be as strong as it needs to be. And again, we're not studying suggestions in the Torah portion, we're studying commandments in the Torah portion. So in this session, it's going to sound like I'm being awfully hard on the men. But if you have read more out of the workbook that I took this out of workbook 3, parts of it, the Spirit-Filled Family. If you've read the whole workbook, you understand that there's a double principle. And actually, when we see things are enjoined upon a male, other places in Scripture, you'll see that same commandment enjoined upon a female. And so if we just take these as a principle or a pattern, we can see that what a man is obligated to do, we can take that same principle and we can apply it to the wife. She also should spend, especially that first year of marriage, learning how to please her husband. But the commandment very specifically applies to the male in this case. So what I'm going to do is a screen share. And I don't see that option. Okay. Now it's an option. All right. Can you guys see that okay? Okay, good. All right, we're going to start out with a name, because even though these seem to be disconnected commandments in the Torah portion, KiTetze, what you find is there's a principle in here that the rabbis, they kind of have a strange expression for it. They say a commandment drags another commandment after it. So just think about that for a second. A commandment drags another commandment after it. In other words, you're not going to really read commandments in isolation from one another. That is, you go through each year, you'll be much more likely to find that this commandment prefaced this commandment, and they're actually joined together thematically. So the first thing I want to look at is reputation. All right, and reputation has to do with maintaining your good name. In Hebrew, the word for name is Shem. right? Just like Shem, Ham, and Yafet were the three sons of Noah. Well, Shem is name or reputation, and it's from Shem that we get the term Semite, referring to Jewish people, especially. If someone is anti-Semitic, we tend to understand they're anti-Jewish, but in reality, they're anti-name, they're anti-reputation, they're there's a couple of different words for curse. One of them is klal, which means to mock, degrade, or make light of another human being, right? And so when we're looking at a Shem or a name, we're not just looking at the written name. I know people get really hung up on the pronunciation of the sacred name and so forth, and they get really bent out of shape when they hear a Jew say Hashem instead of however they pronounce the name. But I think they're missing at least 75% of the point, which is that the name carries with it a certain character and reputation. And so when we say Hashem, part of that is because we recognize that there's probably no name that we could speak on this earth that would contain who he is. The vastness and the greatness and the power and all the wonderful things that are his name. Because when we take them out of the realm of the spiritual, especially, and then we write them on a piece of paper, then something can be lost in that translation. Nevertheless, even on paper, that name is sacred. And if you have books or prayer books, or you're printing off something off the computer with the sacred name Yod He Vav He on it, you need to be really careful how you dispense with those articles. You would never throw an old Tanakh in the trash. You would never take a copy of the Torah and put it on the floor. All right, I see Christians storing their Bibles on the floor all the time. That would be considered very bad form. If you were to take a Bible that had the sacred name, or a prayer book, or any written document that had the sacred Yod He Vav He on it, as a sign that you reverence the name and you respect the reputation and the power behind that name, you're very careful. That's why I have trouble with this teeny tiny little table that I use, and why sometimes I go in the other room so I can spread out on the bar. Because if I have a book like this that actually spells out the name itself, Yod He Vav He, then out of respect for that name, I don't want to take another article on the desk here and set it on top of it accidentally. And what does that do? It just raises awareness that we need to be very reverent and understand the sacredness of the name. And the Jews take it to the point where they will simply substitute Hashem, the name, for the sacred name. But it's about your character. It's about your reputation. And in this Torah portion, we can see how important it is for us to respect someone's reputation, their good name within their community. And, the ultimate irony is even a dead person, if he's left too long hanging on a tree, then it's considered an insult to Hashem. Not just the person who's dead, it's an insult to Hashem, because regardless of what that person is being punished for, he is still made in the image of the name. And so someone who might walk by who doesn't know the details, we simply see a human being being desecrated or cursed by being hung on a tree, and not knowing the story behind it. They don't want reproach, because that's pretty much the way it's worded in the text, is that it would be an insult to the name itself, that you're going to treat that corpse, even of a criminal, you're going to treat that corpse with some degree of respect, and you're not going to allow that tree, or you're not going to allow him to hang on that tree past sundown. Because if he hangs on that tree 1 second past sundown, now the one who put them there is the sinner. That's how fast it changes. And so we get the same idea. No more than 40 stripes. If it's corporal punishment being administered, no more than 40 stripes. Fine, because one more would take him past the human endurance in terms of the pain and so forth. We don't want to get too graphic, but if you know anything about human beings, when they're being tortured, they can lose all body function. And it becomes a degradation. It becomes worse than a discipline or even a punishment. It becomes a humiliation. It takes it beyond the prescribed purpose of the punishment. It even extends to animals. Don't take the mother hen with the eggs. Shoo the mother hen away so that she doesn't see you taking her eggs, so that you don't create that emotional distress. So you see that common thread running through here, that no matter what, you need to try to preserve a human being's dignity. And then it gives you what might be, in some opinions, the least commandment. Remember Yeshua talking about, even the least of the commandments, the commandment concerning the mother bird. So if we're supposed to be conscious of not causing a mother bird distress, then how much more is the implication of these different types of situations in the Torah portion not causing these people any more distress than they're already in? For instance, back then you could take someone's garment as a surety, as a pledge, if they owed you money, and you could hold on to that garment until they paid you back. But according to the Torah portion, even if they still owe you the money and they need that garment to stay warm at night, you are responsible. They don't have to come to you. You are responsible for returning that garment to them, so that they don't suffer the humiliation of trying to track you down and beg you to borrow their garment back. So again, it's human dignity is very important, and a person's name is very important. But it's a contronym. If we look at Shem, we can look at a similar noun, which is Shemama, and it means devastation, waste, and desolation. So there's two sides to the Shem. There's a great reputation, great holiness, great power, great dignity, and so forth, whether we're talking about Adonai or whether we're talking about human beings. But when that reputation is damaged because of the character of the person, then we're faced with a situation of shemama, where you have actually brought reproach or waste to that name. Because see, there's potential in a name. I think that's why we see so many Hebrew roots people replacing their names with Hebrew names, because they say, well, this name is meaningless, or I don't like this name. I want a Hebrew name that's full of potential. And so they'll choose a Hebrew name that they feel like represents what the potential is of their life, that represents them. And there's no problem with that. In naming Jews, typically, even if they're in the diaspora, they may have a normal name like everybody else around them, but they will also have a Hebrew name. They have to have a Hebrew name. And so they have both, maybe. Like in Persia, you might have someone with a more secular name like Kamran, but then that person may also have the Hebrew name of Abishai or some other name. Recognize that you have to live in the society in which you live, but yet you want that Hebrew name because it represents your potential in spiritual realms. So when we don't fulfill our potential in spiritual realms, then it's a waste. Everything that he planted in us, all the good things that he has installed in our lives, all the great things that we're capable of doing with the power of his Holy Spirit, we destroy it with bad character, with a bad reputation. And so what should be a Shem Tov, a good name, becomes a Shemama. It becomes a waste and a desolation. So in this Torah portion, here's our passage. And it says, if any man takes a wife and goes into her and then turns against her and charges her with shameful deeds and publicly defames her. All right, that's the lead in right there that we should pick up on. That's thematic through the rest of the Torah portion. It's about defamation of character. And in some cases, the defamation is justified. But what this suggests is that these charges are baseless, because it prescribes for her parents what they can do to try to salvage not just her reputation, but theirs. In ancient cultures, the good reputation of a family was based upon the behavior of its children in many cases. So if children went out and they conducted themselves dishonorably, then it brought dishonor upon the home itself. And so her home, where she was brought up, they're being given instructions to do a character salvage that not just would restore her reputation, her good name, but restore the name of the family itself. Now, you can see this in excess in a lot of, especially Muslim culture, because upon the female goes the entire weight of the good name. And if she's dishonored, even if against her will, it's not uncommon for her family to kill her for bringing dishonor to the name, rather than kill the person who brought the dishonor upon her through molestation or rape or whatever. And so it takes a great concept, which is we shouldn't be defaming daughters in Israel, and it completely twists it into something that's murderous, and there's no justice whatsoever in it. In fact, it brings a bad name upon their whole religion, or it should. It's weird what people overlook, but anyway, we won't go there. So it says he publicly defames her and says, I took this woman, but when I came near her, I did not find her a virgin. Then the girl's father and her mother shall take out and bring the evidence of the girl's virginity to the elders of the city at the gate. The girl's father shall say to the elders, I gave my daughter to this man for a wife, but he turned against her. And behold, he has charged her with shameful deeds, saying, I did not find your daughter a virgin, which in that day would have meant that she committed adultery, most likely. She may have been molested younger, but because there was such a long period between betrothal and the actual consummation of the marriage, the assumption would have been that she had committed adultery, because from the time that she accepts the gift at the betrothal until the actual consummation of the marriage, she's considered married. So she's not permitted to any other man. The implication here is that sometime during that period, she went out and had relations with another man and therefore committed adultery. So there was no sign of virginity. So the parents are being given instruction on how they can salvage her reputation. And they shall say, this is the evidence of my daughter's virginity. And they shall spread the garment before the elders of the city. All right, now that first sentence, now the second sentence on that slide, where it says they shall spread the garment before the elders of the city, we tend to think that applies only to a cloth that might have been put onto the marriage bed in order to catch evidence of blood. But the Jewish sages in their commentary say there's other reasons why there might not be blood as a sign of virginity. And this is not a literal statement. They say within the grammar of this in Hebrew, what it's meaning is they shall present witnesses, or they shall present evidence to the contrary, to her character and so forth, because they say just the blood, a cloth like that could be altered. You could accidentally wash it out. A cloth could be lost. It could fade. You could even put animal blood on it. You could alter that cloth. There's no way of sealing in ancient times, probably that cloth, where this would literally be the only evidence of her virginity, that they would actually bring in character witnesses and so forth. And as well, what they're saying is, when they say spread the garment, they're saying spread the argument, spread the evidence before the elders. And in some cases, calling evidence or calling witnesses may be, okay, if you believe she had an adulterous affair, then bring a witness. Bring somebody who can testify and say they saw it, because if nobody can say they saw it, then she's innocent, and you can't go around ruining her reputation. And the way that we read it is much more harshly, I think, than the way Jews read it and the way the Jewish sages are reading the text. So it says, the elders of that city shall take that man, if he's offered no proofs, if her parents have come before the elders of the city on her behalf, and the elders find that he's offered no proof that she was not a virgin, it says they shall take the man and chastise him, which means a public flogging. It'll say also in the Torah portion that 40 stripes are the limit, but we know in practice they would only do 39 just in case they made a mistake, if they miscounted. Which, just like the corpse being on the tree 1 second after sundown, now somebody else becomes the sinner. If you were to administer 41 stripes, then you would become the sinner. So in order to have that little cushion there, they would only do 39. So what they're going to do is, if he's ruining this daughter's reputation, he will be publicly whipped for 39 stripes. And it says, and they shall fine him 100 shekels of silver and give it to the girl's father, because he publicly defamed a virgin of Israel. And she shall remain his wife. He cannot divorce her all his days. Now, it sounds like she has no recourse, like she's stuck with a guy that's run around defaming her reputation. In practicality, this is why the oral law was so important in ancient times. Because if we just read it as literally as possible, it sounds like she's really stuck with him. And who would want to be with a guy like that? But they say, no, what he's done is he has lost his right of initiating the divorce, because in Jewish law, it's the husband who initiates the divorce. He has lost the power of initiating it, but the elders can force him to grant her a divorce if she wants one. If she doesn't want to be with dude anymore, and I probably wouldn't, then they can apply pressure to him and force him to divorce her, if that's her will, if that's her wish. But that's a pretty heavy fine just for running your head. But look at the punishment that he could bring upon her by his words. Not just being ostracized by the community, but charges could actually be brought against her. And that was considered a very serious thing. But the humiliation, it's focusing here, it's giving us a little spotlight that ties us in with the rest of the Torah portion, where it says he publicly defamed a virgin of Israel. We don't go around publicly defaming people. That's important. So you say, well, what if I have a legitimate problem or suspicious, or, if I think something untoward is going on in my congregation or my fellowship, what do I do? I don't have any real proof, but I've seen some things and I don't know what they add up to by myself. Well, you would do what this man should have done. Instead of running around bad-mouthing his wife and ruining her reputation, he should have gone to the elders and said, please counsel me. That's their job. According to the law, what should I do? What would they have done? They would have probably referred him to the trial of the sotah, where he's jealous. He thinks something went on. She can drink the water, and if she's innocent, everything's great. But she still may not be really happy with him, but it might even be they could talk to him. Some men don't really understand female anatomy. You know, if they've been kept away from that, it's not like they had the magazines and videos and billboards that we have today. Women could have been something of a mystery. And it was not uncommon for men not to really be able to consummate the marriage on the wedding night. They were just, what's the word? I'm blushing now. Inexperienced. So things don't always go right the first time, or the second time, or the third time. Read a true story about a Jewish community up near Kurdistan. I guess would have been about 100 years ago. And the young man did not understand female anatomy at all. He didn't know what he was supposed to do. You know, they've been so protected. And so for the first several weeks of his marriage, he thinks that her belly button is where babies come from. All right. And so he's doing everything wrong, and she's just, her belly's getting sore, you know? And she's like, I don't know what this thing is supposed to be like. I just don't think it's supposed to be like this. And so I don't know which set of parents they ended up going to for advice, but see, that would be the answer if you didn't know the anatomy and the, you know, how it worked. Not to run around and say she's not a virgin because there's no blood, but instead to go to your parents or to go to the religious elders and say, I'm having this problem, and they can ask you questions in confidence and privacy without your defaming your spouse in the process. I know it sounds ridiculous to us because there's very little that you can't see just standing at the checkout line at Walmart, but if you think about people who have been very protected and isolated from the other sex all of their life, then you can see where there might be a problem on the honeymoon. All right, let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, moving more into the Torah portion, Deuteronomy 24:8-9. It says, be careful against an infection. Nega, where it's saying infection in English, in Hebrew that is nega. And a nega is a mark. So it says, be careful against a mark of leprosy that you diligently observe and do according to all that the Levitical priests teach you. Okay, here again, you have to go to an expert. And so what they're saying is, be careful, because you might be tempted, like, let's say you see this little hair that, oh man, that could be a sign of leprosy, or you see this little sore on your skin, or you say, oh, I don't want to have leprosy. And what do? You might flake off the little scab or something so nobody sees it, or you might pull that hair out so nobody sees it, so they don't think you're a leper. But it's saying here, no, you have to be really careful about these marks. And you do have to go talk to a Levitical priest and let them counsel you. And it says, teach you. That's their job. And see, if you go and you've got this little scab or whatever on your arm, the priest will not just look at it, he will teach you that portion in the Torah so that you can have a better understanding of what a leprous mark looks like. And that's going to decode for us, I think, a lot of things in the book of Revelation that have to do with the mark of the beast. Because he tells us right here a key thing. that will tie into what we've already said. Preserving someone's dignity, not publicly defaming them before you have all the facts, especially. If their character is going to be called into question, let it be by the authorities. Because see, now it's turned the whole question to you. Now you have a mark. You might have been sitting here gossiping about, well, so-and-so wasn't a virgin. But what if this mark comes up on you? Now it's become personal. And you don't want people defaming you and your character and say, well, what did he do that he got leprosy? Because in ancient times, it was understood it was a supernatural judgment. It wasn't just, but I rubbed up against the wrong person or I'm eating the wrong diet. It was considered there was some sort of inside problem that was beginning to work its way out through the flesh, through the skin. So until an expert, the Levite, can diagnose you, the priest, because you don't want your character defamed, you might be tempted to put a Band-Aid over it. Okay, I don't think they had Band-Aids back then, but they might have let the hems out on the sleeves or whatever. But it says, no, be careful. What they're going to do is they're going to examine you. And should it be a questionable mark? Because remember, you're going to be shut up for 7 days for an examination and quarantine to see what happens to it if it spreads. At this very same time, they're going to teach you. So if during that 7 days you say, oh man, have I really messed up? I've been out here defaming so-and-so. I've been running my head when I should have kept my mouth shut. Let me repent during this 7 days. When you come out after that 7 days, maybe that mark won't be there. Or maybe he'll look at the mark and say, well, it's not really spread. Let's do another 7 days. And let me repent some more. Let me make sure I've got all this gossip out of my system. Or, send my apologies to so-and-so. I posted something really nasty about them on Facebook, paleo Facebook. But he's teaching you how to watch your mouth. That's one of the things he's going to teach you, because running your mouth was one of the things that could bring out a mark of leprosy. He tells us very specifically. He says, remember what the Lord your God did to Miriam on the way as you came out of Egypt. Remember, Miriam was speaking against Moses and the Cushite woman. There's different ideas about what that speech was about. That the Midrash says that she was criticizing, actually not the woman, but Moses, because Moses had withdrawn from sexual relations with the Cushite because he was always in the presence. And what she didn't discern was, if the men of Israel had to withdraw from their wives for 3 days before the receiving of the Torah, because of the state of holiness that was required, then how much more Moses, who remained in the presence, basically needed to withdraw from his wife at that time. So we tend to read it like she was speaking against the Cushite. The rabbis read it as, no, she's speaking against Moses on behalf of the Cushite. Doesn't really matter. It was defamatory. Because if she defames the Cushite woman, she's also defaming Moses. And if she's defaming Moses, she's also defaming the Cushite woman, because they're one. And so the Torah portion wants us to realize, especially as husbands and wives, that we are one. And we have no business making defamatory speeches about one another. Why? Because it can draw out a mark of leprosy. That's one of the main, other than pride. Pride is the other big one. But other than pride, defamatory speech, I promise you I've not been drinking. Defamatory speech can draw out leprosy, a supernatural judgment. Why do we want to be careful? Well, it says in Proverbs 18:22, he who finds a wife finds a good thing and obtains favor from the Lord. Obtain, puk, in Hebrew, which is kind of a fun word. I can say puk. It means to draw out or to actively promote. So what is that saying? If a husband will cultivate the good that is in his wife instead of defaming her, then he has, just like on bank deposit, he has a reserve of favor and goodwill that's just waiting to be released from heaven, because it's like her presence, her good presence in his life is what is drawing down all that favor that he wants to obtain, which is a pretty cool thing. Why? Because this good wife is going to promote her husband's cause in heavenly places. And it speaks of this in the Brit Chadashah about the power of prayer in a married couple. Just like, remember, Isaac prayed for Rebekah and she conceived. Well, that same idea is carried over in the Brit Chadashah, that for married couples, we are real power boosters for one another's prayers, for our praises and for our petitions. And again, the Torah portion talks about divorce. It has some guidelines there for divorce. And the thing to remember is, as long as you follow the rules of divorce, and the main one in this Torah portion is, if you're divorced from this husband and you go to another husband and you're with him, even should that second husband die, you can never go back to the first one. That's pretty simple. You can't change your mind. In fact, Jewish law says that if you divorce him officially and you have the get in your hand, that you cannot go back to him. Right now with Yeshua, do we have a little more grace in those situations? Yes, because some people make mistakes before they fully understand the law. In fact, we all made mistakes before we fully understood the law, and now we're probably living with the consequences of those mistakes. But just to get a divorce and to remarry, you're not in sin. This Torah portion makes that really clear. It's the trying to go back and to remarry that brings up an issue. But Yeshua taught us that this was not the best case scenario. But he says it's because of the hardness of your hearts that Moses permitted you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning, it's not been this way. It was one man and it was one woman. And Yeshua is saying, quit aiming for the less than ideal and try to aim for the ideal. That's the restoration we want. We want to go back to the beginning. But when hardness of heart enters in there, then we, of course, we have instructions about divorce, but we hope it never comes to that. So let's go to 1 Peter 3:1 and see if some of these same ideas are carried over. It says, in the same way, you wives, be submissive to your own husbands, so that even if any of them are disobedient to the word, they may be won without a word by the behavior of their wives, as they observe your chaste and respectful behavior. Right? And ironically, in the Torah portion, it's the husband who's running around saying she's unchaste, that she's been disrespectful. But in this context, Peter is saying, wives, even if your husband is not a believer, if he's disobeying the word, and of course, we always have to come in and say, and there's not any other severe problems. No woman is required to stay home and get beaten up, abused, those sorts of things. There's nothing in the Torah that says you have to stay with a husband who hates you and who is abusing you. But if everything else is pretty much on an even keel, you're simply disagreeing about the word, which eventually, if you're yoked to that, there might be some departure over time. If it's a small crack right now, that crack might be huge in 10 years' time. But if they're just willing to live with you in peace and let you study Torah and keep the Torah and keep Shabbat and keep the peace and so forth, what they should notice in you, and this would apply to the husband or the wife, depending on the situation, is if they notice that walking in the Word makes you more chaste and it makes you more respectful, that could win them, even without a word. It's just by what you're doing rather than what you're preaching, because what you're doing is the preaching. He says your adornment must not be merely external, braiding the hair and wearing gold jewelry or putting on dresses. Remember in the Torah portion, it says if you want to take a woman from a city you've conquered, what do you have to do? She has to shave her hair. She has to take off her jewelry. You know, she has to look her worst in front of you. And he's saying, what does that mean? You need to be able to see the spirit of the person more than the pretties, more than the jewelry, more than the pretty dresses, more than the gorgeous hair, whatever. He says, but let it be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable quality of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is precious in the sight of God. He says, for in this way, in former times, the holy women also who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, being submissive to their own husbands. Just as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, which is Baal in Hebrew means husband. All right, I don't know if it's any coincidence that the King James translators chose Lord, but same word means husband. Calling him Lord, and you have become her children if you do what is right without being frightened by any fear. So the key there is that if you're a wife who can be respectful to your husband, that if you can be adorned in the beauty of the Spirit and you can cooperate with him to do the right thing without being frightened by any fear. What does that mean? It means you're not being coerced. That it's the type of marriage where no one is leaning on the other in terms of trying to leverage. You know, the submissiveness in context, which the workbook brings out several more contexts that help us understand this. But this submission that it's called for is a willing cooperation, which makes sense. You can only willingly cooperate with your spouse if you're not frightened. If you're being coerced, and let me see if I've listed some coercion techniques. I think I did later. But what I want you to notice here, it seems to be addressing the wives. And then it says, you husbands in the same way. Live with your wives in an understanding way, as with someone weaker, since she is a woman, and show her honor as a fellow heir of the grace of life, so that your prayers will not be hindered. So what is he saying? He's saying what's good for the goose is good for the gander. It's respecting one another. It's trying to understand one another. How can you understand one another? How can a man who was raised to only respect that which is strong do something that's counterintuitive just because the Torah says so, and honor his wife because she's physically weaker? The world only respects that which is strong and beautiful. But the Torah calls us to respect that which is beautiful in the spirit and strong in the spirit. Because if she's strong in the spirit, remember, she draws down that favor from heaven for his prayers. So it's a mutual respect and honor that has to be given. So what has to happen here? Well, men have to work a little harder to open up to that spirit of knowledge, or da'at, which is a sacrificial kind of love. And if you'll notice, there's not really any prohibitions on the wife during the first year of marriage. But for the first year of marriage, our Torah portion says the man cannot go out and serve in the army. He only serves one, and that's his wife. For the first year of marriage, he doesn't die for many. He only dies for one. He learns to die for his wife. He has to learn to love her in that sacrificial way. And so when Peter writes, he says, live with your wives in an understanding way. It's a bad translation there when he says understanding. It should be according to knowledge. I think the King James may actually do a better job with that translation where it says live with your wives according to knowledge, because knowledge is sacrificial love. Understanding just means you understand it. Knowledge of it means you've experienced it, you've been intimate with it, and you've sacrificed for it. So he says, live with your wives. If we go back to Exodus 21:10, which is the other scripture I wanted to match up with our happy year commandment in the Torah portion, we find that this time of dwelling with a wife in Hebrew is called the onah. Onah. Now that can mean a couple of things. It can refer to when she's on her period, but it more typically refers to a time of cohabitation when you're having sexual relations with your wife, including the entire time of intimacy. Right? So from the time that we figure out, our eyes are meeting and the sparks are flying and we're thinking about something other than supper or whatever, that is going to begin that time of intimacy where where this is likely to lead to. And even after, right? We're not talking about only the specific time of sexual relations. We're talking about this entire time period before, during, and after the act. Because the time before and after is just as important to the intimacy as the act itself. So this whole period of time of intimacy is called the onah, because it doesn't just mean sex. It more precisely means a period of time, which is why it can refer to the time of a menstrual period, because it's a set time. This refers to the time of being intimate with your spouse. It's called the onah. And love does take time. And it's understood to be more than just fulfilling your obligations to the physical body. It's understood in the Torah that it's the time you spend with your wife, as much as the act itself, that develops your relationship. And so we've got, again, it's a sacrificial kind of knowledge. I think even in English, we call it carnal knowledge of a woman. Well, if it's carnal knowledge, it's not necessarily the onah. It could simply be the physical act, but it should be knowledge. It should be a sacrificial relationship that's in place, not only to fulfill the physical obligation, but also to fulfill the spiritual obligation to one's spouse. So when that happens, when we have both the fulfillment of the physical obligation and the fulfillment of the spiritual, that leads to unity. That's how the two truly become one flesh. It's not just the physical act. Instead, that moment of physical act, if the intimacy, like we said, is before, during, and after, the relationship grows greater in unity over time. If it's only a carnal union for the physical act itself, that will eventually end up very cold. And that's what it says, the love of many will wax cold. In any relationship, if it's just to fulfill obligation, that love will grow cold. Because it's as much about the time of communication in the relationship as it is about the act, at least in the Torah world. So, what is it doing in the Torah portion? It's hinting at the dynamics of our spiritual relationship in marriage that are underpinning these commandments, right? So, going back to Exodus 21:10, which is kind of our twin scripture here, it says of a husband concerning a wife. And it's in the context of if he takes a second wife. But I want you to notice, if he follows this commandment, he cannot take a second wife. The very commandment precludes the possibility of taking a second wife. Which maybe this is why even in the process of chalitza, which is in the levirate marriage, if the brother chooses not to marry the deceased brother's wife, it's called yibum. And basically, they can do a ceremony. He says, I'm not taking her as my wife, or she doesn't want me to be her husband, and we're both released from the ceremony of raising up children to his dead brother. But this passage says that a husband, if he's even contemplating taking a second wife, referring to the first wife, he may not reduce her food, her clothing, or her conjugal rights. Those three things are the seed, that's the core of Jewish law concerning marriage. That's where all the Jewish law about marriage, it comes from that right there. Those three things. Because if we look at those three things, food, she'era, clothing, ksuta, and conjugal rights, the ona, what we have is an anomaly. Those are not the three words we would expect to be used in that context. And remember, when things look like they're out of place, there's a reason. So what do they mean? Well, the first one is she'er, that is translated into English as food. And I'm giving you the Strong's entry right here. It means flesh, right? But it also means a near kinswoman or near kin. It can mean flesh as food. It can mean a blood relation, or it can mean you yourself. So when it uses that instead of a word like lechem or ochel, which would be the more normal words in the context, you see that the spiritual message is what's being sent, not so much the physical. Because what is it saying? If a husband gives his first wife his she'er, he is giving her himself. He is revealing his own flesh to her. When does that happen? Not just during the act of sex, but in the intimacy before and after. Remember, it's a space of time. And it's in that space of intimacy that you reveal yourself to one another. You say your most intimate things to one another in the marriage bed. And that's why it is so heinous for a husband to go from the bed and to defame his wife. Because what has just been the most intimate time for both of them has just become something public that is never to be on public display. Your relationship with your spouse is not something you discuss with other people. You don't go into the locker room and swap stories. You don't go with your girlfriends and have a glass of wine down at the restaurant and swap stories. No, because you're one flesh. And when you go out there and when you start revealing things about your intimate life with people who have no business knowing it, what have you done? You've revealed your own nakedness. Because by revealing his, you revealed yours. By revealing hers, you've revealed yours. Now, again, if you need help, where do you go? Well, it says to the Levitical priest, you go to a religious leader. You go to a counselor, someone who is an expert in that manner. And if you need to reveal those things in that context, that's where you do it, with a professional. It's not something casual. We don't discuss it over beer. All right, it's the most sacred and precious thing in your marriage, and it's not to be shared. Why? Because you share yourself with that person. Like I said, there's other words for food that could have been used, but he chose she'er to show you the emotional relationship and the physical closeness. In other words, like if it's a close relative, you're even sharing bloodline. So when you're intimate with your spouse, you can see why in Song of Songs he says, my sister, my bride. He's not talking about incest. He's talking about the closeness of the relationship, that you would be as close to me as my own blood, my close kin. And I would guard that relationship. The next word there, kasuta, which would be like covering or close. Again, it's a covering that's for concealment in some ways. And let's see. There's the root that I wanted you to see. Kasa of kasuta, which is Strong's 3680. Look how it has an idea here of concealing something. To cover, to conceal, to hide, or to spread over. And in the hitpa'el tense, it means to cover yourself or to clothe yourself. And that's what I mean about the two becoming one. At a time of intimacy, in that unity, what is the husband doing? He's not just providing food to his wife, he's revealing his inner flesh, his inner self. When he covers her, when he protects her, remember to cover for protection, you can see there on the definition, what is he doing? When he protects her, he's protecting himself. And in that context, it makes more sense why I think it was Peter who would say, you need to give honor unto her as the weaker vessel. Why? Because you're honoring yourself when you do that. You're one person. And it is that very thing that you see as weak in terms of physical strength that is your strength. It's a spiritual thing. So he protects her. He gives her spiritual clothes. I know Nicole was asking about the head cover, and that comes into play as well. There's other things that go with the head cover. But even males in biblical times would wear a head cover, but they would wear the male. You wouldn't, mistake them for a female. And that's in the Torah portion too. Don't wear things that would cause people to mistake you for the opposite sex. No matter what you see on TV, no matter what's politically correct, it never will be okay for you to try to make people think you're the opposite sex. And it might be fun now, playing dress up, but eventually you're going to have to stand before the throne and that get up. So get out of it. Which was a very politically incorrect thing to say. I would rather make you mad now and make you think about it than have you stand before the throne and say, nobody warned me that I couldn't, watch the birdcage. So at any rate, again, this covering one another is spiritual covering, not just physical covering. And that's what it says in Ephesians 5:28. It says, for no man ever hated his own body, but he nourishes it and he cherishes it. So when a husband covers his wife, it's not just a physical cover, it's a spiritual cover. He's nourishing her and cherishing her because she's a vital part of the one entity. Because she is him. That's what it's saying in Ephesians. A wife is her husband, and a husband is his wife. Like Yeshua said, go back to the beginning. If you want to understand it, go back to the beginning. Let's see. Let's move on here to the actual word onah, which is usually used in the duty of marriage, cohabitation, conjugal rights, but it really does mean the time. Very specifically, it means the time that you dwell with her. All right, and that's why it says, dwell with your wives according to knowledge. Let's see. This is a kind of a reversal, because in the Torah, the onah is the duty of the husband to his wife, not the reverse. In most cultures, it's the wife who's expected to do her duty to her husband. But in the Torah, it's the husband who is given that obligation. But again, to show you this pattern of mutuality, we can read in the Brit Chadashah, it says each man is to have his own wife and each woman is to have her own husband. The husband must fulfill his duty to his wife, and likewise also the wife to her husband. So that's what helps us understand. Sometimes in the Torah we're given the formula, but later on in application we can see that it has a wider scope than what we thought it did. So whereas the Torah would make you think, well, it's the husband who owes it to his wife, when we get to Rabbi Shaul, to Paul, he says it's a mutual obligation. We have this obligation to one another. And like he says, the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband, and likewise also the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. So he says, stop depriving one another. Just gives you the context to make sure you understand. He's talking about the onah, the period of the onah. He says, stop depriving one another, except by agreement for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. There comes the prayer into play again as a vital part of marriage. And he says, and come together again so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Right? The sexual part of marriage, especially the younger you are, is very important in binding you together and making you that real powerhouse of unity. It can affect your prayer life. So if you are like Moses, going to separate from your wife for a certain period of time to just stay in the presence and do some prayer and fasting, make sure it's a mutual decision. And likewise with the wife, he's saying if you need to come apart, make sure it's by mutual decision. Don't make unilateral decisions. Because when you start doing that, you're putting the spouse into a difficult situation because of the power that's within that urge of reproduction. And Satan can notice, because first of all, if you do it unilaterally, Satan will notice the lack of unity in your marriage. That, oh, okay, This one just does whatever he wants to, or this one just always does what she wants to, and they never really consult each other. If I divide, then I can conquer. But especially in this particular area, if your decisions are made together, just like if, ladies, if you start your period, then it's your obligation to let your husband know, so that he will not have that expectation for at least the next 7 days. I mean, there's lots more that factor into it in terms of if there's irregular bleeding and so forth, but let him know. That's your obligation. Why? So it doesn't appear that you're just staying away, making this unilateral decision, that you're making a mutual decision. Oh yes, in the Torah, that we must be apart sexually for these 7 days, or if you count the 7 white days, it's going to be more than that. But whatever you decide as a couple, let him know what's going on. And if it's embarrassing to you, you're young and you're not used to that, and you can leave each other a signal. All right, move the pepper shaker or something. Have a prearranged signal. Or if you're too shy and you do want to come together again, and let him know that my days are complete and it's okay now for us to be together, then move the salt shaker. Just figure out something so that it doesn't sound so forced at first. You have to, that's the fun of that first year. You get to solve those problems together. And a lot of times it's just a communication problem, because if we've been kept apart from the opposite sex sexually, then it can be a little awkward at first. And that's okay. Let's see. We've gone over that. It is a time of holiness. And that's why we want to protect it so much. But the thing to understand, it is more than food, clothes, and sex. It's a relationship. And so at the same time, they're both physical and spiritual. Let's see, we'll skip over some of this because some of this really isn't relevant. I wanted to get down to the Torah portion. Okay, right here. Deuteronomy 24:5. It says, when a man takes a new wife, he shall not go out with the army, nor be charged with any duty. He shall be free at home 1 year, and shall give happiness to his wife whom he has taken. All right, what does it mean to be happy? If we only knew, right? But according to the Torah, a wife's happiness is her husband's responsibility. And it's not the impossible commandment, it's just the natural. Okay? We're different. We have these nasty little things called hormones that rarely work with us. But there's probably a reason that the Holy One put that responsibility onto the male. Because women, we tend to be brought up where we're more willing to sacrifice personally for someone else. We know that most likely we will have children if all other things are normal. And pretty much the mom is going to give up a lot of her life and things she enjoys doing, and she's going to sacrifice that for her children. For the male, he's not typically expected to sacrifice that much, except to go out and to make the living. So, again, sometimes the expectations are gender related, and sometimes they're just cultural. It's the way that we're brought up and the way that we're conditioned, and it really doesn't have anything to do with the Torah. But to tell a man that he's got to make his wife happy for a full year, you can see why he might think that's the impossible commandment, because there's some days I just don't want to be happy. But he's responsible to try anyway. But we know from our paradigm, it's also the wife's responsibility. to try to figure out how to make her husband happy. But just imagine, what if every single marriage began with the husband waking up 365 consecutive mornings with a to-do list that started with, learn how to make my wife happy and give her joy? What would the world be like if from the beginning, like the Torah is teaching us this week, a young man was required and given the time to learn how to love sacrificially? And the Torah is saying learning to love your wife sacrificially is more important than laying your life down for your country sacrificially. You don't think the Father places high value on a man's wife? He does. It's the world that doesn't place that much value on the marriage relationship. So what he's learning to do is to make love to his wife the same way that Adonai wooed his people in the wilderness. Didn't he supply those three things to Israel in the wilderness? He gave them manna every day. And that food was the inner flesh that revealed his word, because Yeshua says, I am the bread of heaven. He revealed the bridegroom to them every single morning. He gave them coverings of clothes and shoes that didn't wear out. He gave them the clouds of glory to protect them and to shield them, to conceal them from their enemies. He gave them their onah. He gave them set times of intimacy through the moedim and the services in the tent of meeting. So he fulfilled all three requirements of a good husband to Israel. He set the pattern for husbands everywhere. So learning to make your wife happy is really an exercise in spiritual growth. It's going to be a challenge, it's going to be a test, it's going to be a hardship, and it's going to be a death of the flesh, because the honeymoon week only lasts a week. The happy year, you're going to have to stretch out for a while. And men are more competitive. They are instilled with a stronger sense of competition usually, because they are expected to go out there and put the physical food on the table and the physical roof over the heads and the physical clothes on their backs. And so with that inborn competition, it's not always easy for them to put their wives' happiness ahead of their own. And this is one of those places in the Torah where you find out that you only win if you finish second. And I don't like the way that sounds either. But see, you can apply that same paradigm to the wife. At the same time your husband is trying to learn how to make you happy, you're also learning him and what makes him happy. And if you both come into it 100% committed that I'm going to finish second to my spouse, then you're both going to win. Sounds easy, but it's very hard. And painful. So, in this case, when we're talking about a marriage argument, the way you win a marriage argument is to lose it. Because that's what Yeshua had to do in order to gain a bride. To the world, it looked like he lost. But he conquered death. So he won. But see, yet to most of the world, it looks like he lost. He looked weak on the cross because he gave up his life. But when we give up our lives for our spouses in much less horrible ways, agreeing to lose an argument, that's how we're probably going to win it, because we're going to win in the relationship. It goes back to Peter's advice to the wives. It has to be a willing cooperation. That submission there, it means a willing cooperation where you're not being coerced. It means you're choosing to cooperate. And that's how you win your bride, or that's how you win your husband. You can see that principle applying to both the husband and the wife. So learning what makes your wife happy is going to build your relationship. Just the example I'm using here is Adam knew how to name the beasts. Every beast of the field was brought to him, and he looked at that animal and he knew the essence of that animal's soul. Well, if we took a poll of wives, how many wives do you think would say that their husbands know the essence of their soul? We'd probably be surprised how many say they don't. They just don't know me. But if Adam could know the beasts well enough to pin a name on them, then how much more should a husband know the essence of his wife's soul and to know the words to speak to his wife? So, the big rule, if you want to grow in your relationship, especially during this happy year, you have to see your wife the same way Adam saw the animals and knew their essence. You have to see your wife not just with your physical eyes. Yeah, she looks good, but you need to see your wife with spiritual eyes. Because when you see her with spiritual eyes, you're going to be much more willing to let her fulfill her role with you as the whole person, the whole unit, the echad. And for that reason, you never, ever use a derogatory name for your wife. Ever. Same way, wives with your husbands, never, ever use a derogatory name. Never turn the Shem Tov into the Shemama, because that's what happens when we start calling one another bitches or whatever. It gets worse from there. When you start using names like that for your wife or your husband, you are creating waste and desolation. You're prophesying that over your marriage. You're sending those words into her spirit, and she's likely to live up to it. So don't be upset when you get what you call. You start calling one another names, and you'll speak it into your life. They will begin to conform to that image. Names are to be built. Reputations are to be built in holiness. Your private life is not for public consumption. Making stupid jokes about the opposite sex in public places is not for us. Because when we make stupid jokes about the opposite sex in public places, those public people are going to assume that you're talking about your own spouse. Now, between you and your husband, you figure out what jokes are okay. You two are the ones who have to know where that limit is. But if you're telling jokes about your husband or you're telling jokes about your wife and the spouse doesn't think it's funny, it's not. And if you don't both think it's funny, it doesn't need to be said. It's bringing waste and desolation into your life. You never defame your spouse. Again, if you have problems, serious problems, go to the experts. Go to the professional counselor, hopefully somebody that's based in the Word. Go to your pastor. Go to your rabbi. Go to the leader of your fellowship, your elders, people who can be trusted with confidential information. Because when you tear down your spouse in public, you're tearing down yourself. Like it says, your own flesh. It's foolish. Let's see. I guess we'll need to wrap it up. This has another context, but I just want to point out some of the ways that dread can fall into a marriage. And during that happy year, that's when we need to work on these things. Once the honeymoon week is over and we start having to solve real problems within the marriage, that's when we'll notice what our tendencies are. And so in that happy year, what we can work with is if we don't get our way, we sulk and pout. If we don't get our way, we give the silent treatment. If we have opinions, we use judging, harsh words instead of counsel. Or if we would rather be doing something else, we become apathetic or inattentive. If it's not fun anymore, then we just refuse to provide the most basic necessities of what it takes to keep a family going. If a man does not provide for his home, it says he's worse than an infidel, an unbeliever. But apathy and inattention will also kill a marriage. Here's the general rule. If you're not even married yet and he can't put his phone down to talk to you, if he can't quit texting to have a nice dinner with you, it's not going to get better. Trust me, he'll be touching that remote control way more than he touches you. So you have to be smart up front. And if somebody appears to be apathetic or inattentive before the marriage, it's probably time to look for someone else. That's probably not the person. If they're a huge sulker or pouter before the marriage, it doesn't get better after, it gets worse. But those little things will pop up, and it'll be more tempting not to have a conversation and instead to sit at the table and text our friends or to check the scores or whatever. We have to set those ground rules during the happy year because you got to find out what's going to make her happy. And if me sitting here, playing fantasy football on my iPhone is not making her happy, then I got to fix that in that first year. Because without a happy year, it gets to be unhappier years after that. Now, here's the good news. I know it's late and we got to shut it down. So let me take this off where I can actually see you guys. There's no telling what you put in the chat box on this one. The good news is if you didn't get your happy year, you just didn't have it because you didn't know about it. There's lots of commandments you didn't know about that now you're learning about them and you're going back and you're rethinking and saying, okay, now I actually read labels in the grocery store. Okay, I get marshmallows aren't kosher unless you get kosher marshmallows. You're learning all these little ins and outs, and those are important, but your marriage is the foundation of your spiritual life. It's the foundation of your prayer life. It's the foundation of the way you're going to bring your children up and your grandchildren. It's the foundation of your mental health. It's the foundation of your emotional health. It's the foundation of the blessings you can expect to fall down from heaven into your life. And so you have to go back to your marriage, like this Torah portion is saying. Defaming one another's character is not the way to go. Because in the good old days, it'd get you some lashes on your back. In the good old days, it would get you some leprosy. So it's not too late. That's the good news. It's never too late to start keeping the Torah. And if you and your spouse want a fresh start, if you are on that same page, if you're not on that same page, I don't know that I would introduce the idea. That could be the straw that broke the camel's back. But if you're on the same page and saying, yes, we want to go forward in the tour, we never did our happy year. You can agree together. Remember, mutual submission. You don't make unilateral decisions. But if you together with your spouse would like to start a happy year, it can even be a mutual happy year. It only says the husband is obligated to make his wife happy for a year, or at least try to learn how. Of course, if you've been married 30 years, you probably already know what ticks them off and what turns them on. But if you want to start over, if you say, you know what, our marriage is good, but it could be great. Make marriage great again, right? So if you want that marriage to be even better, if you want even more blessings to come down out of heaven when you pray, I would say consider starting a happy year. You figure out when you want it to start and what day you want it to end. And I would keep a journal or a diary, both of you, and write down one thing, or a calendar. You could use a calendar and write down at least one thing each day that you know will make your spouse happy. Because that's the commandment. As he will cheer her up. Now, granted, there may be days when neither chocolate nor roses nor anything else will make a difference. All right, we all have those days. But you can even learn on those days that some days there is nothing except my presence, a kind word. Sometimes a kind word, way better than roses. Paying attention for 5 minutes, way better than chocolate. Although I have to admit, I never met a chocolate I didn't like. But remember, it's your presence that she desires. She wants to know your inner self. She wants you to reveal your inner flesh. She wants you to cover her with your protection and your love, your spiritual authority, because when you cover her, that's the irony, you cover yourself. When you're good to your wife, you're good to yourself. And more than anything, she wants your time, the ona, the time that you will reveal that inner flesh to her and have those communications and conversations that build the marriage and truly make you one, so that you become that annoying couple that's been married for 60 years and they finish each other's sentences. As annoying as that is, that's the goal, so that you truly do become one.